They can call in clever people like Teresa Kremin and say, what do you think? And is this a good project, or is this a lousy project? Or what did that other school do? And you could share practice across a variety of places. But some people, and I count myself as one of them, think that this is the greatest advancement for education because it does several things all at the same time. And in that light, that's why that when we set up the MA in Children's Literature here, we set up one module which we called Children's Literature in Action, and that could be interpreted almost in any way that fulfilled most of those words. That's to say, if you were a librarian, a teacher, a parent, or indeed somebody working in an out-of-school environment like the Discover Centre or 7 Stories in Newcastle, somewhere like that, you could study, or indeed imagine. We have Nikki Gamble here from the wonderful Imagine Centre, so that you could study what was going on vis-a-vis some kind of children's literature in relation to the adults introducing it to the children, or indeed if children were sharing it amongst themselves, children that is from 0 to 18. So as broad as that is the remit of this term. And so what happens is we have a group of students who then share what they're doing over a 10-week period, talking about how the project is evolving. At the core of it is some sense that probably talk is going to be involved. That children's talk about the literature. It's not the only way that children show that they're responding to books. Obviously you can draw, you can sing, you can dance. But talk will be involved, and therefore you need some tools to discuss and to talk about talk. What is going on? For the last 50 years, people have been doing it. It's a very much neglected area by authorities. Authorities are by and large not concerned with how children talk, and yet when you analyse the talk, that's where you start seeing children's intellectual and emotional and interpreting facilities coming forward. Some people call it dialogic learning, famously Robin Alexander and Fiona Main, and you can find their sites. They're based in Cambridge, but there are a lot of Americans and Canadians that work on it too. All right, so it's much of this, at the core of it, is a notion about dialogic learning, but you might not necessarily want to call it learning. It might be dialogic exploration, as indeed SF was talking about, and so was Teresa. So the idea that children can explore meaning, and you heard it, I was reading Hannah this morning, she's been on that course, and so is Ellen, Ellen Beer. And Ellen Beer did a study, and I thought what we'd do is rather intimidating to stand in front of you folks and just say, I am brilliant, this is what I did. And Ellen was not happy to be asked to do that. I thought Ellen was brilliant, and I thought Ellen did a wonderful piece of work. So what we're doing is I will ask Ellen some questions, and Ellen will answer them. Is that all right?
That's absolutely fine.
Good. Lovely. So here is Ellen Beer. Please give Ellen a round of applause. And he's clapping as well, so you must know something as well. Good. So Ellen, let's start off. First of all, what was your project? What were you looking at?
I looked at how using humour, particularly humorous children's books, could engage readers who were, I was in year 1 at the time, so I'd been really going with the phonics. I was a phonics master, and some of these children were very able readers, but actually very disengaged. And so I wanted to see if humour could engage them, bring out the enjoyment of the reading rather than just the skill itself.
So you had a reason to do this, that you were worried about the disengagement. You had children who could read, but they didn't seem to be engaged. So this word engaged, how did you engage with the idea of engagement? How can you measure, or you don't even have to measure it, how did you make a judgment about whether children were engaged or not?
So the way I termed it in the research was I said it had to be purposeful and it had to be motivated, and that
They're reading
for themselves, so it would be intrinsically motivated rather than they were reading because I was going to give them a sticker after they'd done it. They had to be doing it for their own enjoyment and their own volition, really.
So how did you set it up? You came in with a pile of funny books? What did you do?
So to begin with, we just read a few tried to share some funny books that we all read. And what was really interesting was the vast majority of the group I had said that they didn't really know very many funny books, and 3 of them said that they'd never read a funny book in their life. To which I said that...
Year 1?
Year 1. I said that cannot possibly be true. You must have read some funny books. They were adamant, no, they hadn't. So it started off sharing some books that I found funny. I brought in my favourite book from when I was young, which
Sam
Sandwich. Go and read it, please. It's amazing.
Sam the Sandwich or Sam?
Sandwich.
Sam's Sandwich.
Very
good. They are.
And then it needed a bit more structure, so from there I took the Laugh Out Loud awards were happening at the time, or the lollies, and so we used the picture books category, and I brought in all of the picture books from there, and we read them, and then the purpose of the sessions was that we would vote for the funniest book at the end, and our vote would go in with everyone else's, and we'd find out the result.
Right, and so just let's go back to this moment where you're sort of talking about funny books. Was that giving you a sort of baseline of what is and isn't funny? Did it give you a sort of, if you like, a shared... Teresa was talking about the idea that you have a sort of shared sense in a group, that if you've suddenly got a phrase or a word that you use, in this case funny, that you then have a shared meaning in the community that is the class.
Yeah, at the very start the children found it very difficult to verbalise any kind of opinion on if they thought something was funny, or particularly why it was funny. The fact that I think we used picture books, although probably they were just of the age they could have been looking at the chapter books category, the picture books meant that it was shared, and we were all sort of in on the joke together, and we could discuss the humour. And by the end of the sort of the 10-week session, they were able to start analysing why they were finding certain things funny. And I think that had we not been doing that as a group, or as a reading community, that they might not have made these connections because they wouldn't have been able to bounce off one another.
Just describe a session. How are the children reading the books? Are they on table sharing? Are they reading individually? Are they doing all sorts of things?
So, at first I would read them aloud. That's one of my absolute favourite things to do in my job, is to read books aloud.
Sure.
Yeah. I would do it all day if I could. But then very quickly they started to build in confidence, and can we read it this time? Or they'd each take a page and want to perform it themselves. So there was a sort of transition from me leading the sessions to them taking ownership of them.
That's very important, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's exactly, again, links with Teresa, doesn't it? The idea of this stuff. How does it become yours? It's no use just us being brilliant. We are brilliant. Yeah? It's no use at all in one sense until they become brilliant, until it belongs to them. So you saw a transition from you to them.
Yeah, absolutely, and not only in the actual interventions which were happening as part of we would stream the phonics, so I'd taken this high ability but not achieving as they should be because they were disengaged, and we would go off separately away from what the other groups were doing, so it was almost like our little secret. But then eventually, over time, they would ask if they could have the books at lunch and at snack, and they would start reading them aloud to the other children in their class and sharing them. And so our community sort of grew. There was a ripple effect. And because I had a group of children from both classes, in both classes from the Year 1 cohort, that was happening across the whole year group.
Okay, now we have a methodology question in this research that we do in the group, which is you are collecting data. So first of all, what was the data and how did you collect it?
So most of the data was either their discussions, which I took on a dictaphone, and I would give them a few prompts. I might have a post-it note with a couple of questions, but I would make it very clear to them that's just to help get you started, and then you can come up with your own questions, your own discussion, and then I would leave. I'd be in the next room, so that there wasn't any sort of power imbalance, and they weren't trying to just say what they thought I wanted them to say. So a vast majority came from that, and then the children, obviously they couldn't all be around the dictaphone at once, so the children that weren't, based on the discussions, were doing either drawings, or we had journals for them to write stories of their own, or make up scenarios, what would happen with different characters who met each other. So it was a mixture really between their discussions and their journals.
Right, so you've got roughly how many hours of recorded material do you think you had?
Goodness, I can't quite. Yes.
10 hours?
Yeah, I would say definitely about 10.
So you've got about 10 hours of recorded material, and now you're trying to figure out what from that material. What's your next step that you're going to do with that 10 hours of data?
So as I went through it, and it had a lot of comparisons actually with what you were talking about this morning. I was was looking at what sort of skills were they using. Were they analysing? Were they creating links with other media? Certain times they were retelling the story and Spider-Man would pop up. So they were making links between TV shows and comics and making it their own. It wasn't just about whether or not they were appreciating the humour. It was all about whether or not they were getting the intertextuality. And
just remind us, have you got the names of the books?
I have got the names of the
Yeah,
books.
so just so everybody knows.
Yes.
So these were,
I'm kicking
how many
myself
of
for
them
not
were
bringing
there?
them. The
4, was it?
there were 4.
Yeah, so these were the 4 books that were in the Lollies Prize last year, or the last time there was Lollies, which is about 18 months ago.
There was I Need a Wee by S. Hendra. These were 2015.
Yeah.
There was Gracie Grabbit and the Tiger by H. Stevens. There was Hoot Owl, Master of Disguise by S. Taylor and J. Julian. And there was Slug Needs a Hug by J. Willis and T. Ross.
Yeah, so it's G. Willis and Tony Ross, yeah. Okay. Yeah, or Jeanne if you want to pronounce it that way. Excellent. So we've got these 4 books, and then they're sharing them, doing all these different things. Now, you've got all this data, and then just take us through that set of ways of analysing, because we tended to call that a matrix in the group, because we looked at various people. You can find them, various people have tried over the last 20 or 30 years to, in a sense, apply a matrix as a way of analysing children's talk. And people have different models. You can find somebody called Emery's Evans. There's my now 28-part matrix, which will be circulated later today, I think, or tomorrow. There are several others. I mentioned Roland Barthes earlier. He has 5 in his famous book. It's a little bit off-putting. It's called SZ. But he has a 5-part code with which he says that people read, respond and interpret books. Umberto Eco is someone else. So people have come up with these. So what I've always suggested to the students is they've got to come up with one that works for them. So tell us your matrix, Ellen, again.
So I used Evans, the framework with 6 stages, going from the kinds of satisfaction that they're getting from the books and the strategies that come with that. But I also, because it was to do with humour, had looked up some research on the origins of humour itself, and look, there are 4 stages of humour, and I was looking at what sort of stage they were working within in the jokes that they were appreciating as well. So I merged Evans' framework and the 4 stages of humour together, really.
Right, and then you've got analysing and evaluating.
Yeah, so it goes from unreflective interest in action, which is stage 1, which goes on to empathising in stage 2. That's roughly where all the children were at the beginning. Some of them were in 3, which is analogising. By the end of the project, all of them comfortably having discussions where they were in stage 3, 4 or 5. So stage 4 is reflecting on the significance of events such as the theme and the behaviour or evaluating the characters in the book. Stage 5 is reviewing the whole work as a creation by the author. So they're starting to remove themselves slightly and look at it as a whole. And then stage 6, they're consciously considering the relationship with the author and being able to recognise some of the textual ideology and the themes and their own reading processes.
And I should say, because Ellen won't say it, that Ellen managed a breakthrough in her presentation of this in her portfolio by colour coding each of these. Because Ellen's work was shown to this year's students, all right, colour coding has now become a massive thing.
I always knew colour coding would be my legacy.
Indeed. They love your colour coding, Ellen. So even though they've invented new matrices, they use the bright greens, the purples. Yes, it makes reading as an examiner just absolutely delightful. So let us now come to, if you like, some of your findings. What did you find out from this group of children? So how many were you looking at overall?
There were 12 children in my group.
Yeah. So what do you think you found out?
So it was really nice, actually. I found out, obviously, a lot of things about them. and also about myself. Our relationship really changed. That I was no longer teaching phonics, and it wasn't really a guided reading session either. It was something completely different, and I made sure that all the sessions were very informal because I didn't want them to think when we were reading I Need a Wee, we can't laugh at the toilet humour because Miss Beer's sitting over here watching us. So our whole relationship changed because of that informality and because we were building this little community, and it was so nice. And I actually felt almost quite naughty. You know, did senior leadership know that we're talking about using the toilet in this session? That's not on the target, it's not the national curriculum. But actually, by the end of the term, I did it in the summer term, so by the end of the year, they had all made huge progress in their reading, but also their writing. In year one, especially once they've learned to write, one of the biggest things is you've got to make this interesting because someone else is going to read it, and quite often you'll find that the understanding of that isn't quite there yet. And I just want to admit, sometimes marking this work can be a little bit dull. And these children were trying to put in their own